It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Now, you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. And you can just contact me by emailing oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. We have a returning guest today, Hugh Turley. We've had him on several times before. The first time I met him was about Vince Foster. The man's an expert on Vince Foster. His report on Vince Foster has been included in the official Star Report. He's done an investigation into the death of Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton's Betrayers, the case against Abbott, James Fox, and author John Howard Griffin, and a previous book called The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton, an investigation. He's many books about Vince Foster. He's a magician. If your rabbit is missing, it could be in his hat. You can check with him on that, Hugh Turley. He's part of a book called with Dean. What's his name again? David Martin. I was going to call him Dean Martin. I saw a picture of Dean Martin earlier. David Martin, The Murder of Vince Foster, that book there, The Assassination of James Forrestal. They're part of a website called FBICoverup.com. Mr. Hugh Turley, are you there?
I am here, Ed, and thank you for reminding me that I can find things on Patreon, because I forgot about that. And I can search it, so I'm going to be doing that. Thank you for reminding everybody.
It's so otherwise it's impossible. You can use
I know.
Yeah, Dogpile. You can find it, but Google, forget it, man. It's like I don't exist on there.
Right.
Remind the audience, though.
And plus, we also support the Ed Opperman Show. We subscribe at Patreon. Very important to do that.
Let me tell you guys, Hugh Turley is a great friend of the show, and he's a great friend to me. He's been very good to me over the years, and he's been helping me book guests more recently, too. But you, remind the audience about yourself. Who is Hugh Turley?
Ed, I'm a professional magician and entertainer, and I've been living in the Washington, D.C. area. I call it the Logic-Free Zone for over 50 years. And I have performed everywhere in this town, all the embassies. I used to go to the White House, but I think I've been banned from there. Some of the things I've investigated ruffled the feathers of the FBI and the Justice Department and the news media here. But I used to rub shoulders with the big shots in town. They didn't want to shake my hand. So that's what I have. I made a living in the deception business. But the knowing magic, I mean, people think it's just entertainment, but there's a common thread in all magic tricks. There's one thing they all have in common, every trick, and that is a lie. There's a lie in every magic trick. And just like in humor, and I don't know if people don't know this either because I do comedy, but there's always an element of truth in every thing that's funny. If you find a joke or something, there'd be some truth in it. So it's just a universal thing. But I have been good at spotting lies because I do it professionally. I do it for fun and for comedy, but I am good at recognizing things that aren't quite right, and that's how I got into the story we're going to talk about today.
Which is the death of Ernest Hemingway. We were talking off the air, and I said I was down at the Hemingway House in Key West, Florida, which I recommend everybody go visit the museum down there. It's a beautiful tour. You see those six-toed cats all over the place. And there was a fellow taking a tour who was writing a book, and he says, Hemingway's suicide was driven by Hoover. Hoover drove him to commit suicide. And I says, what? I Googled it. There's a book about it, too. And I mentioned it to you, and the first thing out of your mouth is, hey, Ed, you know they chopped up that shotgun and they cut it into pieces? I says, what?
Yeah, well, what?
What do you got on Hemingway, my friend?
Well, I got a couple of things. Since you mentioned the tour in Florida, I have to add this to your listeners and yourself. In preparing for this show, I was looking for some things I'd found before online, and I found out there's a virtual tour of the Hemingway house in Idaho.
Ooh.
It's on YouTube, and you can find it. It's just about 15 or 20 minutes, but you can see the whole house, and they walk you through. And since we're going to discuss the house where he died today, after the show, people want to go on YouTube and look up the virtual tour of the Hemingway house in near Ketchum, Idaho. They can take a look at that house.
So how'd you get started on this Hemingway conspiracy?
Okay, well, I got started on this because I was listening to C-SPAN radio. They used to have a program like, I think it was called Book Notes or something. They had a thing about American authors, and they were talking about Hemingway, and I used to listen to the radio in the background. And there was a woman on there named Susan Beagle. She's a Hemingway scholar, and I've emailed her just recently, so she's still around. She's a college professor, but she's an expert on Hemingway. And she was being interviewed on this program, and at some point someone asked her about the shotgun that Hemingway was killed with. And she said that it had been cut up and buried. And I was like, what did you say? Wait a minute. Why would somebody do that? And I'm trying to picture in my mind, what are you using, a hacksaw? I mean, how do you do that? And why would you do that? So after the program was over, I tracked her down. I asked her, can you tell me about this gun being cut up? And she said, I can't remember where I read that. But she said, I know it's in the literature. She said, I know I read that, and I'm sure it's there. But she said, I just can't remember who wrote it. Because she probably read a lot of Hemingway books and books about Hemingway. So anyway, I went up to the University of Maryland, which I'm not too far from, and I went to the McKeldin Library there, and they had a whole section of Hemingway books. It must have been from the top of the shelf all the way down to the floor, about 5 or 6 feet across, and I went through every book. I picked up every one of them, opened it up, looked in the back, see if there's anything about his death, and I found what I was looking for. But it's not where you might think it would be, because it's not in the body of the book. It's in a book by Carlos Baker called Ernest Hemingway, A Life Story. And in this book, in the back, in the endnotes, and a lot of people don't read endnotes and footnotes, but I do. And it's important to do this because sometimes authors will put things in a footnote or endnote that's not really true.
Right.
And that'll be their source. And I went to the archives once just to find some documents that were in a footnote, and the guy said, I know what you're looking for, and it's not here. So that was in the Pearl Harbor book that somebody had documented some documents there, but they weren't there. So I always look at the footnotes and endnotes. And in my books that I've written with David Martin, we always, and same with John and Patrick, John Clark and Patrick Noel, we always have very good footnotes and endnotes. Our sources are top, so I look at other people's footnotes. Yeah. Well, Carlos Baker has a footnote at the very end of here, and it's just called postmortem, and it's almost a paragraph long. But I'll just read a part of it to you here. It says in this footnote, Mary Hemingway and Chuck Atkinson were anxious that the gun not fall into the hands of souvenir hunters. Chuck cut the gun up into pieces with a blowtorch and buried them in a secret place. Well, that's the source for the gun being cut up and buried. And I think it's probably pretty good because the author, Carlos Baker, he was a friend of Hemingway's. He personally interviewed Chuck Atkinson on August 2nd, 1964. He also interviewed Mary Hemingway in August of 64, and also Don Anderson, who was around that time when this incident happened. So he got the right from these people. But that was the story. Was why it was cut up with a torch. But that got me started because I thought that doesn't make sense to me. And then I wanted to know more about his death. So I started.
Wait, can I ask a quick question? Now, was this cut
sure.
up? I'm assuming there had to be some kind of investigation in forensics and ballistics. Was it cut up after it was returned from the police department, or was it never seized by the police department, taken into evidence?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's an excellent question because it actually, in police work, a weapon like that should have been taken by the police and kept for at least a year. That's standard procedure, police procedure, because you don't know if something's going to come up in another couple of weeks or a month later. Something's going to come up that, maybe this wasn't what we thought it was, and we have to do a further investigation. And there should have been some forensics done on the gun because when you shoot a gun at yourself in suicide, for example, the gun is usually close to the person's head, and it draws blood back into the gun. I learned this when we investigated the Foster death, and there's a vacuum, and there would be a lot of blood on the gun. There should have been a lot of blood on the gun if it was fired at close range. But if that's not, there's no police reports, so we don't know if there was blood on the gun. But to answer your question, it was returned by the police to Atkinson and Mary Hemingway 2 weeks after the death. Just 2 weeks.
And what year was this?
Rather soon.
What year was this?
1961.
61.
Yeah.
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 Things were loosey-goosey back in those days, yeah.
So, but
Things were loosey-goosey back in those days, yeah. 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 Things were loosey-goosey back in those days, yeah. 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 So anyway, but
Well, they're really loose when they're covered up in murder. It gets a lot looser, my friend.
Yeah.
Let me just say it. One of the things I do when I do this kind of research is because you have to go back. I learned this from John Clark, Patrick Knowlton's attorney. You have to go back to the beginning, and try to get the information that was first available. What happens at the what was the first story out? So right out of the gate, there's a story from the UPI that was published in the Madison State Journal. It says this. This is the headline was Hemingway dies in gun accident. Okay, that's the headline. But then there's a subheadline, which is contradictory because it says famed author takes his own life at Sun Valley. Oh, wait a minute. One headline says it's an accident. The next headline says he took his own life. Can't be both. Okay, one is called suicide. The other one's called an accident. There's only 4 ways we die: murder, suicide, accident, and natural cause. So he's got 2 causes of death in this headline right out of the gate. The Baltimore Sun published it this way. They said, wife believes writer's death accident. Officials see no evidence it was otherwise. So here it's an accident in the Baltimore Sun. The Washington Post first story came out this way. Authorities to let people judge Hemingway case. How's that? Let the people decide.
Let's take a vote. Let's take a vote.
Exactly. That's the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Now, about a week later, on July 9th, the New York Times published a story because they interviewed Mary Hemingway, the widow, on July 8th. But she only interviewed him on this condition. She would talk to 4 reporters if they submitted their questions in advance. And she changed her story because originally she said he'd been cleaning his gun and accidentally killed himself. But now she said he was only looking at it when it discharged. Of course, she's not in the room. She's sleeping upstairs. Anyway, she also said this in the New York Times story, and this is really significant, I think, because it's an early story. Because later the story becomes suicide. He was depressed. But in the New York Times on July 9th, when she was interviewed on July 8th, she said that she was convinced that he was not despondent and it was an accident. It's pretty interesting. Because later she would...
You know what's interesting too, because with the overdose of Margot Hemingway too, it was the same kind of situation. First of all, it was an accident, then it was suicide, then the family was denying it was suicide. Same kind of situation there.
Right, there's something wrong with it. You know, I got a book. Maybe you're familiar with it because you're an investigator, but there was a book. It's used by police academies. It's used by the FBI Academy at Quantico. I first encountered this book when I was looking into Foster's death with Patrick Knowlton, his attorney. It's by Vernon J. Geberth. It's called The Practical Homicide Investigation. This book is 3 inches thick. It's huge, and it's used to train people to do homicide investigations. And in this book, the latest edition came out in 2015, and Geberth added a new section here. He calls it the staged scene. And Geberth says when a scene is ambiguous, and like in the case of Thomas Merton, they said it was an accident or it was natural cause. It's either one or the other, and it's sort of unclear. He said that Geberth says that's a sign that something's wrong, and it's a staged scene. And this is what we have in Hemingway's case, because initially it was called an accident or accident/suicide. We don't know. We'll let the people decide. So when you have a case that's ambiguous, according to Geberth, that's a red flag. It's got to be one of 4 causes: natural cause, suicide, homicide, or accident. If you've got 2 of them at the same time, Geberth says, look out. You better take a careful look at this because there's something not right. It can't be 2 causes of death. So that was coming out of the gate. Now, Mary Hemingway, the widow, wrote a book in 1977 where she said that she did not tell the truth in the beginning when she said it was an accident. Well, wait a minute. Now she's changing her story. Well, that's not good either. And she really, frankly, she should have been a suspect because she's in the house at the time someone dies violently from a gunshot. She's a spouse. This is someone that police need to talk to. Usually when there's a death of a family member, the police go to make notification. Of course, she's already there, but they want to talk to the family. They